I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about something that I found absolutely fascinating, planes. But before I do that, I thought it might make sense to do a little bit of an introduction so you know who I am and why am I talking about planes in the first place. So, as you know now, my name is Veronica. I'm originally Italian, but I've lived in Austria for about 10 years, 7 of which working as a product manager, and almost 5 working at Adidas Fantastic, where I've worked with some really amazing teams and we've done some really great things to help millions of people around the world have a healthy and active lifestyle. So that makes me very proud. That's part of what makes me really happy to be a product manager. But there's also other things like you can really learn a lot in this job that you can apply to your private life. And also, there's a lot that you learn in your private life that can be applied in your job. And you will soon see what I mean. When I'm not a product manager, I like to do a lot of other things. For example, I really love crocheting. You can see here my latest project. I've loved reading since I was a kid, as you can see, and I really, really love traveling. The problem with traveling, though, is that obviously sometimes you need to fly. And that's a problem because I'm actually really, really scared of flying. I don't like being scared of things, especially when they get in the way of me doing something that I really enjoy. So, in order to keep that fear in check, I decided to try and learn as much as possible about flying. So, as one does, I also turn to YouTube and watch a lot of videos about aviation, trying to learn how planes get airborne, how they land, how they work, and so on and so forth. I discovered a lot of super fascinating information. One of the most interesting things for me was that when something happens, when there's an aviation incident, but also any other kind of incident, we tend to categorize this as something that can be attributed to a human error or something that can be attributed to a mechanical failure. But actually, things are never that easy, and there's always a lot of things that need to come together, a host of factors that needs to happen at the same time for something bad to happen. And not in all cases, but in most cases, the human factor, not the human error, but the human factor is something that can really save the day, or on the other hand, make things more complicated and difficult that they need to be. And these soft skills are something that are really important in the training of pilots and are something that are actually very transferable to a lot of other situations, like for example, our work as product managers, as designers, and anyone who works in product development in general. So, in order to tell you the most important and interesting things that I've learned by binge watching, I want to tell you some stories. Before I start, I'll just let you know that I've tried my absolute best not to make any reference to accidents that had a tragic outcome. However, my third example will make some reference to one such accident, and therefore I will be a lot more vague and only give the information that is absolutely needed to get my point across. So let's start. The first story I want to tell you about is probably one of the craziest stories that I ever heard of. That's a story of a pilot who literally got sucked out of his plane. Imagine this: you are a normal office worker and you're in your office, but it's June, it's very warm, and you're dreaming about going on holiday on the beach. However, you live in Birmingham, that's not really close to the beach. So, what you do is you book a flight, and on the day of your flight, you go to the airport, you board your flight, and you take off. Everything seems to be going just fine until you reach about 17,000 feet. And suddenly, you hear a loud bang. And you see the door of the cockpit being sucked into the cockpit, oxygen masks coming down, panic everywhere, understandably. But what has happened? If we could go into the cockpit at this point, we would see that one of the windscreens has been blown off from the plane, and with it, the captain. Thankfully, one of his legs was caught into some of the controls, and someone managed to get hold of him, didn't let go, so all was good for him in the end. But obviously, it's a very chaotic situation. What happens now is that the first officer takes control. He calls a mayday call and he makes an emergency landing. In the end, they manage to land safely. Everybody's fine, so nobody gets hurt. But obviously, this is a serious incident. So next thing that happens, the most interesting thing for us, is the investigation. The investigation starts because obviously they want to understand what caused this. They found a mechanical reason for this very quickly. The wrong bolts had been used to screw the windscreen back in after maintenance that had been done just the day before. But they also managed to find who was the person who did the maintenance. But at this point, we might think, well, there was a mistake. We found out who made the mistake, and probably that's a very bad mistake. This person might be fired. But this is not the goal of aviation investigations. What they actually did was they sat down with the engineer who did the maintenance, and they tried to understand how maintenance usually works. They really tried to understand what was the a normal situation in his daily job. Because they did it in a very cozy and relaxed environment and not as a formal investigation, or not a formal interrogation, they managed to get some information out of him that really they wouldn't have gotten otherwise in a more formal setting. And what they find out is that some practices had crept in into the maintenance processes, and they had gone undetected by the company. Based on this, they were able to make some recommendations, which is usually the end goal of the investigation. They made some recommendations to be implemented afterwards that prevented the same error from happening again. Now, why is this interesting? Can you make any parallel? Can you think of anything that happens in our work that can resemble to this? For me, the first thing that came to my mind was how we deal with incidents. Usually when we deal with incidents, we really dig deep and try to understand what's the root cause that caused it, and then we fix it. But I would argue that we can use the same approach for a lot of other things. It can be just a bug that has crept in and you want to figure out how is it possible that nobody noticed it before. It can be some processes that are not working perfectly and you might want to improve them. So really looking very deep at the cause. One thing that I found really helps me in doing this is the 5 why technique, which actually I don't use so much with customers, but more internally. So when I figure that something might need improvement, I start asking people like, why are we doing this way? What problem are we trying to solve? What have you observed? And so on, to the point that sometimes I might be annoying, but it really helps get to the bottom of things. And then you can have really fruitful and useful conversations with the other person or people. One thing to keep in mind is that at this point you are never looking for someone or something to blame or to punish, but really you want to figure out what is the root cause that caused something to happen to be possible in the first place, and you want to fix it so that it never happens again. I'm going to move on to my second story now. And the second story is usually referred to as the Gottröra miracle, because Gottröra is the place where it happened, and a miracle because, again, everybody gets out of this alive. Also, it was a few days after Christmas, so even more of a miracle. So in the previous story, I mentioned that the first officer took the commands and managed to land the plane safely. But obviously, this is not something that he could have done alone. There's always a team of people behind this. So in that case, there were cabin crew that were helping him in the cockpit and also managing the situation in the cabin. There was an air traffic controller in the tower that was helping him getting all the right directions for landing and clearing the air before him. So really, it's a very well-oiled machine, the way these teams work in aviation. And I think who better than us can understand how important that is. But back to the story, imagine this time that you are a pilot and you're going towards the aircraft that you're going to fly today. You do all your checks, and when everybody has boarded, you just take off. Very shortly after takeoff, what happens is that you start hearing some very loud noises and some whirring noises then. And you understand that something's not quite right. But the problem is you don't have a checklist for this. You haven't been trained for this specific situation. So it's really hard for you to understand what is happening. This crew is actually very lucky because in the cabin, there's one passenger who is actually a pilot himself, just not on duty. And he had noticed that this specific error was something that didn't have a checklist anymore. It used to have one before, and there was no specific training for this, but he knew the error and he knew how to deal with it. So this was back in 1991, and he was able to just go up to the pilots in the cockpit and say, hey, I'm a fellow pilot. I think I know what's happening. Do you need any help? They obviously needed the help, so they welcomed him and they kind of integrated him in the team. One thing that was really interesting in the investigation, and especially in the cockpit voice recorder, as it was analyzed later, was that when this new pilot came in, one of the things that he did first was he addressed the flying pilot. In a cockpit, there's always a pilot flying and a pilot monitoring. So he addressed the pilot flying, and he told him, just look outside, keep looking outside, keep flying the plane. Why is he doing this? What he's doing here is trying to really strengthen the idea and of the separation of roles and responsibilities. This is something that is really important in pilot training, and it basically means that when something happens, obviously the most important thing is to keep flying the plane. And the one person who is flying the plane needs to be focused only on that. He doesn't need to be disturbed or interfere in the work of others. So at the same time, the other pilot and this new pilot in this situation were able to troubleshoot and take all the necessary steps. They were not able to get back to the airport, but they did find a place where they could land the plane, and everybody gets out of it safely. Some minor injuries, but overall, everything is fine at the end of the story, although the issue was actually pretty serious. So as you can see, there's a strong factor of collaboration that really saved the day in the situation. Even the cabin crew were really crucial in this last part, because usually they would need to have the command from the pilots that they can initiate an evacuation, but it was not coming. They understood the situation correctly and they initiated it on their own based on their training. Why is this also important for us in the product development world? First of all, I don't think I need to tell you that collaboration is very important. But one really important part of collaboration that sometimes we don't talk about enough is how important it is to respect the separation of responsibilities. When we work in cross-functional teams, there's different people with different roles, different responsibilities, different knowledge, different skills, different areas of expertise. And each person is responsible for making different decisions. Now, of course, we always need to talk, we always need to collaborate. But at the same time, we need to also respect the boundaries of this separation, because that way everybody can be focused on doing their part in contributing to the overall outcome. In the case of the pilots, it was to land the plane safely. In our case, it is to deliver value to the users. But in the end, what matters is that the team works well together, and then everybody has the autonomy to do their job properly. This has a bit of a corollary, because when it comes to teamwork, there are a couple of things that can have a very bad or a very positive impact on how the team works. First of all, the power dynamics. Although in IT we are used to have a very flat hierarchy, there's of course also the junior PM and the CPO. There's the junior designer and there's the head of design. So there are some power relationships there. But it's very important that these are not played out in the wrong way, so that the person who is more senior and has higher responsibility and higher power in the company is open to listening and really actively listening and taking in inputs, even from the most junior person in the company. The flip side of that, so the other side of that, is what can actually have a positive impact, which is creating a culture of psychological safety. This means that even the new hire should feel like they can speak up and say something if they feel or see that something is not working as it should. Worst case scenario, they're learning something, but they should always feel like they are in a place where they can speak up, even to someone who is more senior than them. And another important part of psychological safety is self-awareness. It has happened in also some aviation incidents that after some upset, the pilot realized that he was not in the right place because he was still shaken by what just happened. And he just realized he was not in the right place to be flying a plane. And he had the self-awareness to recognize this and hand over the controls to the first officer. This is something that I could really see some parallel in my personal experience, because one thing that happened once to me was that one of my former team leads realized that they were really busy with something else outside of work, and they could just not focus on work at that point in time. So they came to us and they told us, I don't have the mental capacity to focus on work right now, so I need to take some time off and focus on other things in my life. And what I really liked about this was not only the openness and the self-awareness, but also the fact that within the company, this was recognized, this was accepted, and it was respected, so that this person could take some time for things that were other priorities at the time, and then come back to work and perform at their best. Now, getting to the third story, again, I will be a bit more vague about this, but generally it's a story of failed communication. In this case, we are in the late 70s, and it's early spring. Everybody is trying to take some time and fly south to some nice destination. So there's a lot of people that are flying to this beautiful island. And what happens is that the airport that they're flying to is actually needs to be closed for a few hours. So a lot of the aircrafts are being redirected to another smaller airport nearby. They need to wait a few hours, and what happens during this time is, first of all, that there's like this small airport is becoming very crowded, and the second thing is that the weather deteriorates a lot, so the visibility is very low. When the original airport opens up again, there's multiple planes that want to start taking off, and specifically there's one that is now on the runway, and because of the fog they cannot see anything outside. So one thing that they cannot see is that there's another plane on the same runway. They are now, they're not moving, they're talking to air traffic controller, trying to get clearance to take off. Two things happen during this exchange. The first is that there's some interference in the communication, so some things are not heard properly. This is the 70s again. But the other thing is that both from the cockpit and from the tower, they use the word takeoff a lot. They refer in that case to something that is a process that actually has different phases. But at that time, there were no specific rules about how to use this word. So between the interferences and the use of this word in a much broader way than it is now, the consequence was that the people in the cockpit, they did not really understand correctly what was being communicated to them. They thought they had takeoff clearance, and they take off while the other aircraft is sadly still on the runway. Now, what is really interesting here is, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things here, but what I want to focus on is this use of the word takeoff. After this specific incident, there were some recommendations made and implemented that basically translate to this day to the word takeoff never being used this loosely anymore. It actually can only be used in very specific situations, like, for example, when clearance for takeoff is given. This is something that I could really relate to when I think about my personal experience as a product manager working in different companies. Because one thing that I learned from this, or that this confirms, because of course in aviation the stakes are a lot higher than in our cases. So even when we know things, sometimes we need to be reminded, is the importance of really aligning on the specific meaning of certain words that are used in your company. So it can be, for example, a metric, and you want to make sure that all departments are using the metric with the same name, but also with the same definition, the same way of calculating it. In my experience, I had one situation in which, for context, at Adidas Fantastic, we refer to all people who use our app as users, but also we have a membership program in some countries. So users from those countries, we refer to as members. And I realized at some point, talking to someone with from another department, that they were using the word member to refer to all users. It was by luck that we found out, and we realized at that point we're using the same word, but we're talking about different things. We're talking about different groups of people. And this allowed us to clarify that on company level, so that now we really know what we're talking about when we use the one or the other. But you can easily imagine how this could have caused misunderstandings and issues in the future if this had gone undetected. Another thing that is really important when it comes to communication in the aviation industry, you might have seen this in movies, is that when the people in the cockpit and the people in the tower are talking and listening to each other, there's a lot of standardized communication, and that there's a lot of repetition. Like, a lot of things are said and then read back, so that everybody's sure that the other person understood correctly. And this gives everybody the chance to correct misunderstandings. So in our case, or in my case, I've noticed that sometimes I need to make presentations or workshops about a specific topic multiple times, sometimes with the same people, sometimes with new people. But what is really always worth it is to take those few 2, 3, 4 minutes at the beginning to recap all the information. Just repeat the information to make sure that everybody still remembers everything that is said, that has been said before. Everybody is on the same page and everybody is aligned on what you're talking about when it comes to the specific topic. One final thing that I found extremely interesting in this incident, but also in other cases, was the analysis of the voice that was made during the investigation based on the cockpit voice recorder. Sometimes it's really easy to understand, and it's really clear to understand if a person was really under stress when they were talking. When I learned about this actually prompted me to reflect a lot more on how I communicate with people, especially when I'm in a situation of stress or fatigue or frustration or something like this. Sometimes it means I take longer to reply to a message. Sometimes I need to push a meeting for a later hour or time or day, just so that I get back into what is the right mindset for me to talk to other people. These are some, not all, but some of the most interesting and important thing that I learned from binge watching aviation videos, and that I could also relate to and apply in my day-to-day work. If I can give you just some takeaways from these are the followings. First of all, always look for the root cause of issues. Maybe some people will be a bit annoyed by you, but it really, really helps to have better conversations. Secondly, collaboration is crucial, and part of the collaboration is being able to recognize and respect the boundaries of each other's role, responsibilities, and again, who makes what decisions. And thirdly, be very intentional, very picky, very precise about how you communicate, whether it's the definition of words, repetition, and your own mental state. I have an added tip for you that I thought I'd share because it's useful anyway. If you should ever find yourself in an emergency landing, do not take your hand luggage with you. Just leave it on the plane. That helps a lot of people get out of the plane faster. I hope that this was interesting or insightful for you. I hope I made you curious also towards this very high importance of soft skills. And that's it from my side. If there's anything that you'd like to know, then I'm ready to take questions.
Love that. Thank you so much, Veronica. That was great. So there was questions, and then you started answering them as it went on, which I love. So I'm not going to cover
Cool.
your own situation. So that's really good. You mentioned about psychological safety. I thought was very interesting, and then you go on to self-awareness. How do you practice self-awareness? It can be quite difficult, or how would you even
Yes.
recommend people practice self-awareness? Because that sounds easy to check yourself, which we all try.
Yes.
But we're ourselves, and it's hard to judge ourselves. We think we're doing the right thing. So what's your advice there?
Yes. Obviously, as you said, this is absolutely not easy. I think that there's a few things that help. One is just trying to be more aware, not just at work, but generally in your life. Try to recognize what you are feeling in different situations and try to give it a name. It might sound silly or easy, but when you start doing it, it's not that easy anymore. I think there's a lot of content that I've seen around about educating children about this, and I think this is really important because learning this as an adult is a lot harder. But yeah, this helps. For me personally, and I realize it might not work for everybody, meditation helps because it when you meditate, you are in a state where you don't need to look or hear or do anything else. So you're alone with your thoughts, and it is not easy, but it really helps you to recognize these things better. And another thing that you can do not on your own is actually talking to other people. So asking people questions about a specific situation. So for example, if there's some changes, let's assume that there's some changes at work and you don't know how to feel about it, and you don't like these changes. You don't know why, but you feel stressed and frustrated. It's always good to talk to someone else and say, how do you see this? What's your take? And usually when the other person talks, then you can recognize if that person is feeling the same as you. So it kind of confirms maybe your thoughts, or if the other person has a completely different understanding. So it helps you maybe have a different perspective on the same thing and understand if it's just you, if it's your emotions that are playing into it, or you are seeing something that other people are seeing as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really nice way of phrasing that. And it's often difficult in work situations to find the problem, or pinpoint a problem, because it's often a multitude and collapse of multiple problems all at once. It can even be culture. How do you break it down in your organization?
Mm-hmm. Again, this is not very easy. I have to say I'm lucky to work in a culture where in an organization where the culture is quite healthy. So it might be a bit easier to recognize certain issues. As I mentioned, like even not prioritizing work is sometimes seen as a normal thing to do and something that people can do. But I think it's still, even in this case, it's still really difficult because, or maybe especially in this case, because when you work in an organization that has a good culture, usually people like are proud that they know that they're doing something to have this positive culture. So it's very hard to recognize if the culture might actually still have flaws. This is really difficult and really depends on where you are in the organization. So for example, maybe someone from HR might have a very different perspective about this than someone who is in a different part of the organization. But again, one thing that I really try to practice a lot is talking to other people, asking other people's opinion about the same thing. So it happens, for example, that you see something that like doesn't feel right with you, and like, we shouldn't be in this situation. Like, why? And the first thing I usually do is I go to like a group of trusted people and I say, hey, I'm seeing this. Are you also seeing this in our culture, in our environment? How do you feel about that? I try not to state my personal feeling first so that I don't bias the other person. I just want to learn what they're seeing. Again, if it's more than one person seeing it, maybe it's two, maybe it's three, and maybe you talk to other and it's four and it's five. And if this group is really big, then it's a bit easy to also bring it up to someone who can do something about it. But I would agree that it's extremely difficult because you're biased towards thinking that you are already doing your best, and you probably are, but there could be still flaws.
Yeah, no, I love that on so many levels, just the way you broke it down in the beginning and brought it through scenario by scenario. It reminded me of a story in Sydney of a woman who was giving birth, and she, instead of the epidural, and she was put in an antiseptic because they mixed the process in the hospital, whereas they put it into a silver tray. So the nurse was effectively at fault, but it's the processes and the stories along the way that leads to a huge problems. And so taking that scenario of the airplane, of how they actually talk through the engineer to find the problem is a beautiful analogy. So thank you so much for sharing that. And it was a pleasure to meet you. Your talk will be available online as well for people, so we'll be sharing it out because it's incredibly valuable. Thank you, Veronica, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank